You are listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report. For the latest news, views and analysis, head to our website, theafricareport.com. I'm Nick Norbrook. Welcome to the show. My guest this week is an award-winning writer, Maaza Mengiste. You can say hi on Twitter at MaazaMengiste. She's the author of 2 books. Her first novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, came out in 2010, and her latest, The Shadow King, has just been published. You might want to bracket them under historical fiction, but they quickly escape that label. They are excellent history, but they are also beautiful stories. And given what's happening today in Ethiopia, both are important books to read as an outsider to get beyond the surface noise. Just as an example, Ethiopia was a colony of Italy, but the powerful central parts of Ethiopia are seen as colonizers by other Ethiopians, particularly in the south. And the novel doesn't try to gloss over any of these subtleties. Given our current global spasm of chest-beating nationalism, just checking what our notion of a nation actually is feels important. I start by asking Maaza about the moment when she discovered that her own great-grandmother had actually been among those who fought against the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935.
I knew that the male members of my family had fought, but I had no idea. No one ever mentioned the fact that my great-grandmother had also enlisted to fight in the army. I learned that fact completely by chance. Actually, when the book was almost finished, I had found enough material on women who had fought in the war that I could move forward with the story, and I was really captivated by it. And it was just by chance when I was in Ethiopia at one point doing a last-minute research trip that I mentioned to my mother some photographs I had found of women, and I was explaining to her the role of women. And she just very casually said, well, yeah, there was your great-grandmother. Don't you know about her? And it completely shocked me. Yeah, I was completely taken aback. And I had talked to my mother about this research for years. I had been telling her about this story, and it never came up that my great-grandmother had gone to war. But not only that, but she had sued her father for the gun. It just wasn't, no one ever said it. And I almost didn't believe her. I made her call all of her sisters on the phone and just one by one ask them to tell the story. And they all had the same story about my great-grandmother. It makes me wonder about what we call history and how we define that those narratives that get to be remembered and retold, and those others that are still very present, but only within certain groups of people. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the ways that maybe the spaces of women, the home, the kitchen, the hearth, the areas they gather really also contain whole histories that we have never heard because they tell them to each other.
In a way, this sort of touches the note that you have at the beginning of your novel where you say that war, it's not just a masculine story. In much of the literature on state creation, war is a key part of a nation's sense of itself. In Israel, the women fight proudly. I'm not sure that the patriarchy is any less strong there, but still, women are not considered subordinate in the way they can be elsewhere. They're known as warriors. It's an important part of the national identity. The Kurds, obviously, they lack the borders of a nation state. Why is it important to get the stories of women who fight into the conversation?
Because I think women can tell another kind of war story that we are not used to hearing. I think war from a woman's perspective is compounded not only by what happens on the battle lines, but what happens within the. Oops, I'm sorry, my computer might have made a noise. But what also happens away from the front lines, within the spaces that where they might be seen again as vulnerable, not soldiers, but as something else. Maybe this is where the patriarchy takes over, is away from the front lines. I can't help even now thinking about the accounts of women in the military in the United States that have been slowly getting wider publicity about the levels of abuse, physical, sexual, mental, that happens. So these women fight or do the work that soldiers do. And then when they're back in the barracks or they're somewhere else in more personal spaces, the idea of what it means to be a woman in a patriarchal world really takes effect.
Without anthropomorphizing too much from a state to a person, the more a nation has a sense of itself, as it were, then the better the political conversations, the more flourishing its politics, its economy. So many African states are often fictional states that have everything to do with competing colonial appetites, boundaries that cut across pre-existing political communities, creating chaos. What's the role of historical literature and art more broadly here?
I think, well, in terms of, do you mean in terms of my particular book, or do you mean in general?
Yeah. I mean, Ethiopia seems to be quite different in that sense, because although it had, two Italian incursions, they were, very brief moments in the life of the nation, and there does seem to be more of a sense of what it is to be an Ethiopian, even though that is hugely problematic, and we can talk about that more later. But it seems in many other African states, it's more complicated.
Yeah, I think I was wondering about how that the pride, the national identity of Ethiopia as even in 1935, an African country that was still free of colonial influence, colonial power, it was independent in 1935. How does the identity, the pride that comes from that filter down to people who are in the highlands, who are farmers, peasants, illiterate, in some ways the poorest of the poor in a country? When you haven't gone further than 5 kilometers from your home, because that's the distance you really need to go in order to live, to sell in the markets, to gather the goods, to farm, and then to come home after you visit relatives or friends. If you've only gone 5 kilometers, which is about the average, what does the Ethiopian independence mean to you? How do you recognize what a country is? And that was a question that I had to ask myself when I was creating my characters. And I began to realize, at least with Hirut, who had never been that far from home, when somebody says we have to fight to keep your country free, she wonders, what is a country? How big is that? And is a country worth as much as she is worth? And so she really has these questions that seem very basic, but are really complicated negotiations with her individual place in this larger thing that's called a country. And for her, it's not about an Ethiopian identity. It's an identity that she creates for herself, which is someone that is worthy, or much more worthy than what other people tell her she is. And I think outside of being an Ethiopian. For Hirut, it's the fact that she's a soldier that means more. She can understand that, and that gives her something that's for her much more powerful than I'm an Ethiopian, if that makes sense. I think she starts to complicate that once she's actually confronted with Italians. But for her, she is a soldier.
She does. I mean, Hirut does seem to grapple with this historical injustice that was omnipresent. I imagine in the Ethiopia of the all powerful landlords of the 1800s and beyond. I was in Japan a few years ago, and I remember speaking to the descendant of one of the landlord class who were dispossessed after the Second World War in what was really one of the radical moments of land reform globally. A whole bunch of rich landlords had their land seized and redistributed to Japanese family. And I was speaking to this Japanese woman who was incredibly angry about it. And I realized, how much this was still a very much a live wire issue in Japanese society today. And I remember in your previous book, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, there was a character who talks about the Derg, this bloody military rule in positive tones, precisely because they'd made an attempt to do a similar thing, liberate the peasants who were so heavily taxed by the landlords. And I imagine these issues around landlords, history of the possession, dispossession are just as live in Ethiopia in the 40s, in the 70s, and today as they are in Japan.
Yes. And, much more so for people that Kidane would come in contact with, who is one of the noblemen that has large tracts of land and is born of, nobility and has lived a life of privilege in Ethiopia, as well as his wife. They're well aware of their position and the high social hierarchy. And I think people like Hirut are well aware, but it's not until Hirut gets older that she begins to realize that she has other possibilities besides being just this maid that Kidane and Aster think of her as. Yeah, and it's interesting to think about the way that the 1935 their social classes were so deeply ingrained in Ethiopia, and there was no mobility at all. And I think by 1974, when the Derg came in, it was one of the things that they thought that there was going to be a difference. They thought there would really be social mobility in a way that was egalitarian and peaceful, but it didn't happen that way.
Right at the beginning of the novel, you speak of the box, this box which travels the whole way through the novel, carried by Hirut, containing the letters of this Italian photographer, Ettore, and you write the dead pulse beneath the lid. And it felt like, having read the novel and then coming back to this and rereading it, this was almost a metaphor for all the unresolved, undigested events that the characters, the entire country, in fact, had to live through in this horrific invasion. And is this perhaps where literature is so important, in the ability to help in the digesting process, for want of a better word? I know, for example, Germany, in the decades after the Second World War, did much more in terms of engaging and digesting their own difficult history than France, the country where I'm currently sitting, which still has a lot of work to do, really, in terms of engaging with their own history, especially the colonial history.
Yeah, I think that's. I think you're absolutely right that the literature helps create a language and a way to talk about things that a nation or groups of people would find very difficult to address. And I think these narratives, whether it's through fiction or through poetry that comes after a war, helps create collective memories a collective vocabulary with which to address